All right, thanks guys for joining. This is going to be a fun video, very informative. And I'll try to make it very simple, learning about the past. Okay. What I think we'll do is I want to read a couple sentences from this book. And so I took a picture of it and put it on the screen. The Historical Atlas of Ancient Civilizations. And not that this book really matters, but I thought that this was a good place to start. It says here, civilizations are divided into primary and secondary types. A primary civilization is one which developed independently of any outside influences. These include the Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Indus Valley, Chinese, Minoan, and Olmec civilizations. We'll touch on all of these. A secondary civilization is one which developed under the influence of older civilizations. Examples of these include the classical civilizations of Greece, Rome, the Aztecs, the Mayans, etc. So before we go over what is on the screen, I want us to grasp an important concept. And that is, history repeats itself, or like the Bible says, there's nothing new under the sun. Okay. So when we think of the word Renaissance, most of us, think of high school, about learning of what is modern day Europe, but more specifically, papal Rome. Okay. And when you type in Renaissance here on Google, you get the same thing, right? And so what was the Renaissance, right? Renaissance means rebirth in French. So what was this rebirth? Okay. This was Rome, okay, that had just come out of the Dark Ages, and they were grabbing information from ancient Rome. Okay. And so it's not that they were learning anything new. They were grabbing things from the past and bringing it into the future. And so you see that with what's displayed here, right? This is the Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci. Well, Vitruvius was a Roman architect. Okay. This right here is a painting by Raphael called The School of Athens. And it's the same concept. You have here on the left Plato, and on the right you have his student, Aristotle. They had very different ways of thinking. You see Plato here pointing to the heavens, and Aristotle pointing to the earth. If you were to look this up into more detail, all of these people are artists and mathematicians, architects of the past. Okay, this right here, for example, is supposed to be Michelangelo, right? Which Michelangelo painted this right here, the Sistine Chapel, where you have God giving life to Adam. But anyway, the point that I want to make with this is that Rome was grabbing, knowledge from their past. So papal Rome was grabbing information from pagan Rome. Okay. The same thing happened in history, right? You have ancient Babylon, okay, that really grew too big for itself. We're going to come back to this. And then the ancient world, okay, so I'm saying ancient Babylon, 2000 BC. And then about 1200 to 900 BC, the ancient world entered a dark age. And at 900 BC to 500 BC, you have Neo-Assyria and Neo-Babylon. What does Neo mean? It means new Babylon, or a rebirth, okay? Because Babylon, that which we think of when we look at Nebuchadnezzar, for example, that was Neo-Babylonia. And what they were doing was they were grabbing, things from the past, from ancient Babylon. There's a lot of evidence for this. Okay, we'll get to it. But again, the mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of all harlots. Those that know Bible prophecy know that this is talking about the Roman Empire. Well, it's just, there's nothing new under the sun. Okay, it's copying that which was in the past. Okay. Another concept that I think is very important for us to to understand before we go further into Mesopotamia is, how is the past recorded? Okay, let me pull up a couple things. One of the ways in which the past is recorded is through stratigraphy, which is counting how many layers of dirt an object is in the ground. Okay. People don't realize that this is not that scientific. Okay, it's two ways of thinking. Either those layers of mud are layers of time, being millions of years, or they're just layers of mud that occurred in a worldwide flood. Okay, we'll cover this a little bit more as we continue. But you cannot, you can't perform radiometric dating or carbon-14 dating on sedentary or this type of rock. The only type of rock that you could perform that on is that which just came out of a volcano. Okay, but again, we'll get to that. And as far as radiometric dating, we're going to come back to that because it has to do with something we're going to talk about, and it will show why it is not reliable for investigating the past. Other ways that we look into the past are through what we find in archaeology. And so this would be, for example, cuneiform, which is the way that the Mesopotamians wrote. Cuneiform means wedge shapes because they would have a reed and they would make wedge shapes into clay, right? Like you see here. Of course, the Egyptians used Hilographics, okay, which they would either paint on stone or etch in stone. Of course, we have the saying that, when something's written in stone, meaning that it's there for good. Other ways of communicating was through papyrus scroll. When papyrus, the paper would disintegrate rather quickly, and so, only in the best of conditions is this preserved. And so the information that we have today is copies of copies of copies of copies, going, hundreds of generations. And this is very much like this old game, Chinese telephone or Chinese whispers, where you have people that are in a line and one person says the story to someone else and they say it to someone else. And at the end of the line, it becomes a completely different story. And so, back to papyrus scroll, this would be, it would be oral tradition, okay, is another way to say it. And so I want to go on to write something here on the blackboard so that we can understand something. What a lot of people don't realize is how the past occurred. And so let's kind of, again, we're just kind of putting a picture together, and then we're going to come to Mesopotamia. Okay. What I did in this graph is I started with the birth of Christ, okay, and it's going in 1,000-year increments, okay, down to the flood. By the way, there's nothing that is recorded you cannot prove anything to have happened before the flood, okay, before 2400 BC. And we'll talk about that in a moment, especially when it comes to radiometric dating. It'll make a lot of sense when we look at some things that happened in the past, okay? But a lot of people don't know that the history that they are listening to is, something that was, that we are taking someone's word for it. So recently I was talking to a friend and I said, just paint a picture for me. What's something that happened way in the past? And he said, well, ancient Egypt, which I wasn't really looking for that answer because it's very vague, right? Ancient Egypt covers so much time. But that's actually, something interesting is, most people don't know that ancient Egypt is recorded pretty much by one man. Okay, we'll see that on Wikipedia. There was a man here that lived in about 200 BC, and his name was, we'll come to it again, Manetho. Manetho, actually, before I go any further, if a man here in 200 BC writes all this history, when he's a priest, by the way, so he was already a little biased, and you can see that in his writings. When you have someone that, he didn't have, like, the internet, he didn't have an ability to really investigate into the past. What I'm saying is that he was a man of his time, and we're taking someone's word for it. A lot of his work, okay, this is 200, by the way, around 200. a lot of his work he copied from Herodotus. I'm just going to put Herodotus here. So Herodotus, who was about 400. And so, again, a lot can be lost in just 200 years. But he's copying the work of Herodotus, and something that we might look at later is that Herodotus had a contemporary whose name was Xenophon. And Xenophon, was also lived at 400. Both of them, give an account of Cyrus the Great. Cyrus lived here in 500 is when he, about 530 is when he died. But anyway, so about 500 you have Cyrus the Great, king of Persia. Herodotus and Xenophon wrote at the same time a biography, a story of Cyrus the Great. And again, maybe we'll look at that, but they could not be further from being different. Herodotus says that his grandfather tried to kill him. Xenophon says that his father loved him. Anyway, I'm just being very vague, but what I'm saying is, here in just 130 years, the story is completely different, by contemporary historians. And then you have historians that are copying the work of historians who disagree with each other just in this short amount of time. And so when we're looking and taking these people's word for what happened in the past, it's kind of crazy. It's just not, anyway, it's just, we have to think for ourselves. We're going to come to this because it's actually really important. I think where we'll start now is talking about Mesopotamia. The oldest writings that we have that are etched in stone come from right here, 2100 BC. And it comes from Mesopotamia, or the Sumerians. And we'll see that right now. We'll jump on the computer and break that apart. So here, when you type in the oldest text in the world, as mentioned, it mentions the Sumerians, which are out of Mesopotamia and around 2100 BC. Like I said, they cannot prove anything older than 2100 BC. We'll touch on this more as we go along. What is this tablet talking about? It's talking about a worldwide flood, right? The Epic of Gilgamesh. Well, when we look again at this list that we had of civilizations, what is the one thing that they all have in common? Mesopotamia, Egypt, Indus Valley, China, the Minoans, the Olmecs, Greece, Rome, etc. The thing that they all have in common is that they all have a flood story. All of them, if you're to take their word for it, they say that they came out of a worldwide flood. And so, again, just type in list of flood myths or flood stories in Wikipedia. And here you have Mesopotamia, you have India, you have China, you have Egypt, which would be in Africa. You have the Aztecs, the Mayans in Mesoamerica, the Olmecs in Mesoamerica, etc. And so, even when we go down to the writings here, the writings of Plato, Plato mentions the great deluge of all. So he mentions that there were other floods, but he says that there was the great flood of all. So interesting. So why is it that all of these guys, they have an account, they have a flood story, but we, as our generation as a whole, don't accept this flood story, and we believe that the world is millions or billions of years old, when you cannot date rock with geometric dating. We'll come more into that as we continue. The world is not that old, and it's something that a lot of us have not really investigated. So what we're going to do is, you type into Google the oldest civilization, and of course Mesopotamia pops up, right? The Sumerian civilization is the oldest civilization known to mankind. And as we already saw, Here, the oldest text in the world is out of Sumeria. And so let's click on Sumer or Sumeria. And when we read about Sumeria in Wikipedia, you see that, that it was located right here between the two rivers. So Sumer is right here in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia means between the two rivers, right? Because it's between the Euphrates and the Tigris, and it was obviously very fertile land. And so people populated this area, and then of course they went down to here, to the Nile Delta, and populated this area. But what I'd like to get to is just talking about, if the Mesopotamians, if the Egyptians, if they all say that they came out of a flood, what do they say? What is their history? Okay, not the history that we make up. What is the history of the people that lived through history? Okay, what we do is we're gonna scroll down and look at the table of contents, and it says here Neo-Sumeria. Okay, and this is an important point. Again, I'm clicking and it's not working, so I'm gonna have to scroll down. So when you come to Neo-Assyria, it says here, right, Neo means new. Just like we mentioned before, you have ancient Babylon in Neo-Babylonia. Well, if this is Neo-Sumeria, then there was an ancient Sumeria. And we want to look at their own writings and see what they record. It says, later, the third dynasty of Ur under thus and thus king. Okay, but what I want to focus on is the date. This is about the time that they're talking about, that this started, 2100 BC. Okay, well, where does that fit, okay, in our timeline? Well, we just saw that. That's where we saw the oldest record of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it's 2100 BC, happened right after the flood. And so Neo-Assyria comes up right here after the flood. And they say, actually in their own words, that they came up right after the flood. Because if you go to something that is called the Sumerian king list, and you can look at their own, if you want to interpret this yourself, it's very much, eroded and I'm sure difficult to read. But they have it here translated. I don't think it's translated 100% correctly, but they themselves say that there was a civilization, okay? And then the flood swept over. So they record their history, then they say, then the flood swept over. And then they say, after the flood, the kingship had descended from heaven. Okay, we're going to touch on this in a moment. But before that, I want to look at the Bible and see if we're seeing a parallel here. Remember that in the Bible, okay, this line represents the flood around 2400 BC. Everyone before the flood lived a lot longer. They lived up to 900 years of age. Okay, that's a long time. And then you see after the flood that the lifespan begins to diminish gradually. Okay, this is very important for a lot of things. I don't even know if I want to start explaining the list of things. One of the things I'll mention now is radiometric dating or carbon-14 dating. Carbon-14 dating is measuring, carbon. It's measuring the decay of carbon and nitrogen. Okay. Well, when you're measuring the decay of, an element, you're assuming that the decay is always at a constant. Well, what's the problem looking at this picture? If people lived in the past 10 times longer, and then it gradually diminished and went down to what it is today, which, by the way, this correlates with 1750 BC. Why is that a problem? Because this is not a constant, okay? This is a gradual diminishing of lifespan. And so there's a book actually here that I have on ancient history. I took a picture of it and I want to pull it up and make a very important point here. So this book that I have is called The History of the Ancient World, okay, by Bauer, who is a professor for ancient history. And here it writes, dating anything that happened before Hammurabi, that is 1750 BC, is problematic. Now, we don't have to go into why it's problematic. This is written from a secular standpoint, someone that believes that the world is millions of years old. But what they're not taking into account is that, and this is not the only reference, by the way, scientists say that radiometric dating after the point of 1750 BC starts to become problematic. There's something weird here that we can't figure out. Well, the thing that they're not taking into account is that as we look at the Bible account and at the Sumerian account, which we'll look at in a moment, that at 1750 BC was when life, organic material, began to act very differently from how it had acted in the past. I hope you guys are grasping what I'm saying, because it's a very important concept. So I'm saying that radiometric dating is useless when you go beyond 1700 BC, okay? Because they are using a constant when it was not a constant, okay? So we'll come back to this chart, but you see here that after the flood, that lifespan diminished gradually. Well, we should expect to see that, right, outside of the Bible. And we do. When you go to the Sumerian king list, right, as I already read, after the flood swept over, the kingship had descended from heaven. And then it mentions here that this king ruled 670 years. This king ruled 420 years. And as you go down, it diminishes. 3 on average, it diminishes. It's again, it's an old tablet. But here you have 300 years, 140 years. And then as you go lower, it goes to 126 years, 30 years, 15 years, 9 years, 8 years, etc. And so what we see is what we see recorded in the Bible, okay? A gradual decline in the age or the reigning of kings. There's a couple of concepts also that I'd like to grasp from here before we move on. Because it has a lot of impact on our past. Okay, one is with the ability to procreate. Okay, and so going back to this graph that I was putting out, if you have 8 people that come off the flood right at this point, and then you have civilizations that are coming up around 2100 BC and onward. Okay, this is the same time that you would have Egypt. Egypt and Mesopotamia came up, I should say Neo-Sumeria, as is recorded, comes up around 2100 BC. And then we have the Indus Valley, and we'll get to that, but those all come around this period. Because people were procreating right here, they were repopulating the earth, and traveling, everyone in their own direction. And remember, when you travel in a certain direction, the past is going to be recorded with oral tradition, right? They're not going to be carrying around stone with carvings. It's too much weight. Our books, which are made of paper, weigh heavy enough. Imagine, carrying just tablets of stone. Okay, it just doesn't make sense. And so, generation after generation after generation, things are going to become, muddled, and they're, again, the concept of Chinese telephone, it's going to become a different story. It's going to hold a little bit of its integrity, the major parts, like the flood, that's what they all say. But the story of how that happened is different across the board, But they're similar. It's all a man, a righteous man. In ancient China, they say Yu the Great, which is a parallel to Noah. He was a righteous man, brought his family on the ship, saved them, repopulated the earth. All the same story. They all have the same story. But when we're talking about procreation, remember that the people here are living hundreds of years. Okay, it's a gradual diminishing of lifespan. So let's look at the chart. So Shem, for example, here you have Noah that came. Of course, he was he was 500 years old or so when the flood occurred. Well, his sons, Shem, it doesn't list them all here. Shem, Japheth, Ham, they lived for 500 years after the flood. That's a lot of, procreating. Okay, we don't know how many children really these people had. We don't know. It's just, we don't know what's recorded and what's not recorded. And so not only men, of course, would be able to reproduce for a long time, but women would be able to bear children for a longer period of time. And then when you look at all these generations afterward, Shem lived for 600 years, okay? And then Arphaxad lived for over 400, over 400, over 400, over 200, over 200, over 200. So these generations here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7 generations where you have people living and procreating a lot more than if you just go into Google and type in an algorithm of procreation from the flood with 8 people. We don't know how many children they had, okay? And, for all we know, God said, be fruitful and multiply. And they had, quintuplets, or we don't know if they had multiple children at a time. That's something that we see recorded in our history. I was looking at a Russian woman that has the record for children. I don't know, it was 60 or 70 children. And it's because every time she gave birth, it was to, quintuplets, etc. What I'm trying to say here is that we have the world that is repopulating at a rate that we don't quite grasp, okay, mathematically. Also, think about this. We know in the Bible that Nimrod was very corrupt, and he would have lived in this generation of Selah, would have been a contemporary. So Nimrod, who founded Babylon, who founded Nineveh, which is actually named after him, Nimrod, and I should say, Nimrod, I do believe, if you want to look it up yourself, is, I'll just do it right now, Sargon of Akkad. Sargon of Akkad. If you type in Sargon of Akkad and you learn about his history, it's very much paralleled to what we see with Nimrod. And then when we talk about Neo-Assyria and Neo-Babylon, it's not a surprise that Sargon II, okay, was from Neo-Assyria, and he named himself after Sargon of Akkad the first. And so it's just, again, it's a renaissance. He was just grabbing information from the past. Okay, hope I didn't lose you there. But so you have here, and I just lost the page. Okay, there it is. So you have here Nimrod that would have lived in this generation, and he was a great warrior, and I'm sure that he was very, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so when you're living for hundreds of years, and let's say that, he lived to about this period, he would have outlived how many generations? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. He would have outlived about 7 generations. Imagine being Nimrod and outliving 7 generations. What would these people think of you? They would think you are a god, and you could say that you are divine, that you are God, because you're living so much. In your mind, you think that because you're living so much longer than everyone else. You have 7 generations that die before you, and you think for a little while, you think to yourself, am I going to live forever? Am I a god? And so he starts to glorify himself, and people start to make stories, mythological stories, and he starts to propagate stories just to retain his power. Okay, this is something that civilizations did all the time in the past. Ancient Egypt is recorded for doing this. Different tribes in the Indus Valley, ancient China, they fabricate the past to appease the populace, to just for their own people, for intimidating other civilizations that might be a threat. Okay, and this is called power projection, or PR, public relations. Right, you seed misinformation to use it to your benefit. All governments do this today. And so they did the same in the past. And that's another reason why it's hard to go through recordings of the past, because you don't know what's true and what's not. And a lot of fables and a lot of stories are created from these lies. And so Nimrod would have created lies. And this would also be the birth of secret societies, because I'm sure that him and his cousins all lived longer than all these generations beyond. and they had, mystery religions that were created in order to control the masses. Secret society. This is the birth of secret society, and it comes from ancient Babylon. But I'm starting to think that we are doing an okay job for just covering Mesopotamia or Sumeria at this point, which I think is a foundational piece because it's recorded, again, to be the first civilization. And so we need to see, how did they record their history? And their history they record is very similar to what we see in the Bible. Okay, and so when we come to Egypt, which here I pulled up, as I already mentioned, Egypt is, their history is recorded by Manetho. And so if you press Command F for find and then put in Manetho, you can find that it's only mentioned once. But we're going to read this, what is written down here, just to understand the past a little bit better. The Dynastic Period, okay, which the Dynastic Period, if you go to the table of contents, is the oldest recorded period in Egyptian history, the Dynastic Period. Okay, so their oldest point in history is contemporary with the Sumerian and Akkadian civilizations of Mesopotamia. Okay, Elam is modern day Iran or Persia. But it says here, the 3rd century BC. Okay, that is 200 BC. So in 200 BC, Egyptian priest Manetho grouped a long line of kings from Menes, the first pharaoh, to his own time into 30 dynasties. A system still used today. Okay, this is what is used today. Okay, and what he did was he grabbed the oldest king and he grouped it into a long line of kings. Okay, it doesn't mean that the kings all ruled at the same time. Maybe there were cousins. Egypt is a large area, and this is actually, a lot of people will do studies on this and show that it's not a long list of kings. It's people that ruled at the same time in different regions. And so they overlap each other. And so while he is recording, it says a system still used today. And so historians, they still use this system going back to the early dynastic period. But there's no evidence of this outside of what someone wrote over 2,000 years ago. And so it's something that we need to keep in mind. I'm going to mention one other thing before we stop this video, and then maybe we'll go into Indus Valley, into other things of the past. But I want to show you how history repeats itself. And so what we're going to do is grab this right here, and I'm going to do something a little different. So I'm going to grab an eraser, and this is very helpful. This is a concept actually I just learned like 2 days ago. So I know that as I let it sit longer, I'm going to understand it a little better. But what we're going to do is we're going to, instead of listing all of this information, I just want to create 2 lines, okay? 2 lines of time. Okay, and so what we're going to do is we're going to look at this time, okay, this time in history and this time in history. And instead, this is going to be now, okay, to the birth of Christ. So this represents a span of 2,000 years, okay? This is from Christ, okay, right here. What will I put? Anyway, you guys know. So this is from the advent of Christ to Mesopotamia, okay, essentially. Well, what happens? Okay, what happens here? Remember that we already covered here that, if this is 2,000 years, we'll say halfway point is this 1,000 years. Remember right here we had a Renaissance, okay? Before the Renaissance, okay, of Rome, they went through a dark age. This period right here was the Dark Ages. Dark Ages. Okay, I can't write from this angle, but you get it. Renaissance, get a piece of paper so you can do this yourself. Renaissance and the Dark Ages. What happened right here? Right here was the fall of Rome, okay? And I would say that Rome just became, I guess, too big for itself, right? It divided, okay? And that's another very important point. Rome became too large for itself, and it divided into the Eastern and Western Empire. And then it began to break up even further. And so after Rome fell apart, the world entered a dark age. That makes sense, because when you lose order, when you lose structure, is when you learn, when the trading system, everything starts to, you have bandits that start to come in. That's when you enter a dark age, okay? And you lose information, you lose structure, education, etc. So a golden age of Rome, ancient Rome, it falls apart, enters a dark age, and then you come into the Renaissance. After the Renaissance, you have the Enlightenment, right? We have the Enlightenment writers. I'm not even going to mention them because I don't want to glorify them. Then you have the Industrial Revolution, and then we are here today. Okay, please write this down. It's important. Let's go to the past. The same thing happened. Babylon became too big for itself, and it divided. Well, what I mean by Babylon is, what was this? This was Mesopotamia, in between the two rivers. Mesopotamia. And it was actually the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Assyrians, and the list goes on. It was a lot of people that were fighting for power. Babylon breaks up. Even Egypt with Moses breaks up. And you have these great civilizations that begin to fall apart. Okay, what happens? Afterward, the world doesn't have the same structure, and things start to fall apart. And you enter the Dark Ages, okay, which occurred, I'm drawing this off, I'm not drawing it in line with this, but this was the Dark Ages, which, paralleled this. And let me, just so you see it, I'll pull it up on the computer so you can get a visual, because I'm still recording the screen. If I type in the Sea Peoples, which is a really funny name to me, but you see here, the Sea Peoples are purported seafaring confederation. It says here, the late Bronze Age collapse of 1200 to 900 BC. This is also referred to as the Dark Ages, okay, from 1200 to 900 BC. Well, remember what happened in 900 BC. In 900 BC is when Assyria, Neo-Assyria, took over Israel, okay, or the northern tribes. And so here Assyria comes into power, and then Neo-Babylonia comes into power. Okay, so we'll go back to this. So, Golden Age of Mesopotamia, it falls apart. Dark Age that we saw there from 1200 to 900. Okay. And then we entered into a Renaissance with Neo-Assyria and Neo-Babylon. Do you see that it's repeating itself? Golden Age of Rome. Dark Age after it collapses. Renaissance. Okay. After Neo-Assyria and Neo-Babylonia fall, you have the Enlightenment, right? You have Buddha, Socrates, Confucius. You have all these philosophical writers, which those in the Enlightenment in this period, okay, I have the book here. I don't know, it's too high for me to grab, but A Historical Introduction to Philosophy. All these philosophers, all of them, Spinoza, I should say, Nietzsche, etc. Who are they writing about? They're writing about these guys that happened in the Enlightenment, that happened after the Renaissance of Babylon. After the Enlightenment, okay, we have here an industrial revolution, right? Just like we had an industrial revolution in our time. Remember that right before Christ came, Herod the Great was building. They were great builders. They were building up Rome. They were building up Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple, etc. And so you have another parallel. And so here with the coming of Christ, now we are at the second coming of Christ. I hope you guys see all these parallels. Okay. And so when ancient Rome is called Mystery Babylon the Great. It is, right? So ancient Rome parallels ancient Mesopotamia. Then the fall of Rome created a dark age, which with the fall of Mesopotamia also created a dark age. Then you have a renaissance out of the dark age, where you have papal Rome coming into power. And then you had Neo-Babylonia and Neo-Assyria also coming into power, because they were doing the same thing. It was a rebirth, taking information from the old times. After its collapse, you have, the Enlightenment, where we have thinkers, they're called philosophers, philosophy, love of wisdom. Anyway, I'm sorry, sometimes I get frustrated. So you have lovers of wisdom, that's what philosophy means. And then here, after the collapse of Babylon, lovers of wisdom. Okay. Again, and then you have, what did I mention? After that was the Industrial Revolution with ancient Rome and with Judea. Here we have our Industrial Revolution with New York City being built, London, Berlin, Shanghai, all these great cities. And now we're at the Advent, the first coming of Christ, paralleling the second coming of Christ. Okay, I hope that made sense. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to post this video. I know it's a lot of information. A lot of people, again, that don't know history. We'll make another video and we'll talk more about what happened after Mesopotamia, after Sumeria in particular. And we can look at the Indus Valley, the, what else was there? The Olmecs, which is important to cover. Ancient China is important to cover, etc. But all of these civilizations really came into prominence after that time period. Actually, let me just type in ancient China and I'll show you just that's what they record in their own history. And so again, some people, they all record different things, but ancient China. And when we look at ancient China, I like to go to Wikipedia because I'm familiar with the format. But it says here, the earliest known written records of China date from as early as 1200 BC. Again, and then from Shanghai, the Shang dynasty, from 16 to about 1000 BC. Again, nothing comes before the flood. And every civilization has a flood account. Therefore, there was a flood. Okay, and when you cannot, stratigraphy is just measuring, it's two ways of thinking, either layers of mud, okay, that happened from a flood, or layers of time from stardust over millions and billions of years, which doesn't make sense, because if you look at just, here we go, layers of the Grand Canyon. When you look at the layers of the Grand Canyon, what do you see? You see that they are flat, right? This is, of course, someone that believes that the world is millions of years old. But you notice that it's a layer that's flat, 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 flat. Okay, what's the problem with that? Well, if this was millions of years, they're not taking into account the millions of years of erosion, whether by rain, by animals, by earthquakes, by a whole bunch of things. And so the very fact that we have flat lines is because they were mudslides that happened during a global flood. This is impossible. It's impossible to have flat lines. Okay, what is it called? Superpositioning. It's impossible to have this when you're thinking that the world was Pangea and it's been moving apart for millions of years, and that there's been earthquakes and animals that have been walking all over. It just doesn't make sense. So the world is not that old, and there's more evidence that the world is young than that the world is old. And the more that you dig into it, the more fun it becomes, and the more exciting it is, because there is a God. You can trust this God. He is a personal God. He has an interest in your family. And as the Bible says, the just shall live by faith. Okay, it's not just about evidence, but it's about this relationship that you have in believing that God will fulfill his word beyond what you can see. He's bigger than what you can see. And this faith and this relationship, it grows with time, with the more time that you spend in relation with this God. So just give it a shot for those that don't know the scriptures. And be careful, because a lot of things are misinterpreted, and we look at things through the lens of man, right? There's the old saying, we have more to unlearn than to learn. And so often when we're looking into the past, or looking to know God better, we're often putting in our own bias and our own misconceptions we're putting into what we read, and it just skews everything. And so I'll stop talking there. Okay, hope this video was somewhat helpful, and I really do. I hope it was helpful, because this is good information. All right, until next time. Thank you.